My very special guest needs no introduction, but I'm going to do one anyway. He is a journalist, author, and political activist. He writes a column for The Guardian and contributes to the New Statesman, Tribune, and recently joins The National and Mehdi Hassan's Zateo. Owen Jones, thank you so much for coming on Turn Left. It is a real pleasure.
It is a massive pleasure. I don't know. I should say I've not written for the New Statesman for a very long time. I don't think they'd have me. I think they're kind of like the aspirational in-house journal of Starmerism, the New Statesman.
Potentially client journalism, yeah. So
yeah,
maybe
a riveting
out
read.
Of that now.
Riveting read. Don't you find? I always think the New Statesman have really fascinating, engaging articles. Always a pleasure.
Fascinating is one way of putting it, I would say. And you were trending on Twitter again, which is a regular occurrence.
Was I?
Oh, you didn't know? I believe it was around the leadership debate between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, which took place yesterday. But yes, you were trending again. And we will talk about both political parties. But I think I'll start off with the Tories. I want to get your entire assessment of the last 14 years of this Tory government, which is most likely going to come to an end. But what's your assessment?
Oh, my word. I think this is quite a unique stretch of government in British history, because if you take Thatcherism, you and I think would agree was a catastrophe, but its defenders would die in the ditch for Thatcherism. They would say Thatcherism was this transformative government. It changed Britain in Thatcher's image, smashed the trade unions, slashed taxes on the rich, privatised utilities and services, reduced the whole role of the state in the economy, flogged off council housing. Now, I think you and I would go, well, that is a disaster for the country, and we are paying the terrible, catastrophic consequences of all the things you did. But they would go, well, that was a massive success. They would say, wow, transform Britain, it saved Britain from being the sick man of Europe. All this other kind of revisionist history that they come up with. I mean, actually, growth after Thatcherism on average was lower than it was before. But yet, you get my point. This stretch of Tory government has no defenders. No, nobody. Like, you get a fascinating phenomenon where in the Daily Telegraph you have articles which argue that Britain is finished after 14 years of Conservative rule. I mean, that's quite astonishing. I mean, if you're there, if you're a right-wing commentator and you've had a load of actually pretty right-wing Conservative governments, and then you're there saying Britain is a disaster, it's finished, we're finished. And the other point is that the reason they're in such a mess is partly they failed on their own terms. That's the point I was trying to, in quite verbose terms, trying to get around to saying there. So they failed on our terms, but they failed on their own terms. They can't point to living standards. People are on average worse off than they were when they came to power. They can't point to growth, terrible growth by historical standards. And the other point is they don't have any excuses, because it's not like they had one brand of conservatism. They went, well, if we'd only tried this other brand, because actually they went through their lot. They had the kind of rollback to the state plus faux social liberalism under Cameron, because it wasn't really, I mean, they were, migrant bashing all the way through that, but that was the kind of presentation. They had the kind of weird national conservatism of Theresa May. They had the kind of full-throated right-wing populism of Boris Johnson. They had obviously the laissez-faire, massive economic libertarianism of Liz Truss, and then they've got whatever the hell this is supposed to be. So they've gone through every kind of iteration. We've tasted them all, and they've made, each one's made us sick. They've made the country sick. So their cupboard is empty.
I mean, you made a really good point there, actually, that there are defenders of Thatcherism of the last 40 years of the Conservative Party. Well, I mean, both New Labour and the Conservatives. And there's no defenders now. But I guess right-wingers can trash the current Conservative government without attacking the ideology of neoliberalism. They just say they failed on their own terms. Or either you're getting people like Richard Tice saying, well, actually, they're left-wingers, they're socialists, which only moves the debate further to the right. So I think that's a really good point there. And it does show that actually, yes, the Conservatives have failed on their own terms because there is no one to defend them. But, when we look at the polls, right, do you believe some of these polls which put them in double digits in terms of seats? I mean, we all know they're headed for disaster, but do you think the scale of defeat is exaggerated?
No, I think it's totally plausible. And we're not used to that in our system. I mean, in Canada, they have an electoral system that's not you can compare as a first past the post type system, and their Conservatives got nearly wiped out under this system in the 90s, or the early 90s. They did come back, so there's a kind of a warning there. And there's, the reason it's possible is politics, as we already knew, had become very febrile. And one of the reasons for that is there's no question that um, party loyalties, natural party loyalties, have eroded. I mean, it is astonishing in the sense that you can look back to 2017, and the combined share of the two parties was the highest it had been for a very long time. So that went against that grain. You got 82% of the population voted Conservative or Labour. That was still a case of lots of people had flocked to Labour or the Conservatives, having not voted Labour or Conservative for many years before that, because they both won in 2017. Labour won the same share of the vote as they got in a 2001 landslide, and the Tories won the same share of the vote as they got in 1983 landslide. So they both won a landslide share of the vote in normal times at the exact same time. But what's happening is you've got this erosion of party loyalty. So everything's become very fluid. So you can get sudden, very dramatic shifts in how people vote in a way that you didn't before, because you'd always have a locked down group of people who weren't going to shift from Labour or Tory, regardless of what happened, basically like 30%. And that's changed completely. And I just think because you've got such a unique situation in that, Partygate is enough to really finish off a normal government. I just think people forget the visceral anger that caused a lot of people, where you had the biggest national emergency since World War II. You had the biggest public health emergency since the Spanish flu. And the government just broke their own rules when people couldn't hold the hands of their dying relatives. So that cut through in a very emotional level to people. They were like, you're taking the piss. Like, we suffered. 8 million people live alone in Britain, horrible solitude that they had to suffer during that period. And they saw people just like partying until they were throwing up down the walls and doing karaoke in Number 10. So I think there was that. And then the lying, that's enough to finish off a normal government. And it was a big mistake. They shouldn't have got rid of Boris Johnson. I don't think they would have won, but they wouldn't have lost as badly as they have, because you don't get rid of a prime minister unless you've got someone who's going to ready-made, who's going to fix the problems that you've got. They did Liz Truss. That's what finished them off, because you had then the collapsing NHS, worst squeeze in living standards in modern period. Again, that's enough to finish off government. You had all the scandals, because people forget the Boris Johnson collapse fell with the Owen Paterson scandal, and then it ended with the sex, a sex pest who tried to keep in place. But Liz Truss finishes them off because she's tries to introduce policies people object to in this era, handing tax cuts to rich people. They don't like that. But that's one thing. To try and do that and fail and crash the economy and hit people's living standards by mortgages and rents going up. After that, most of the population decided, they clocked out. They went, it doesn't matter what the Conservatives say or do from here on in, we're not going to vote for them.
I mean, I agree with you on your point about Boris Johnson, actually. They were probably wrong to do that in terms of electoral coalition. And Boris Johnson did have a core support there, because in a time where neither political party has their base, Boris Johnson was like the last essence of that. And I'm glad you brought that up too, because that's a conversation we've had with many people recently, which is that if we look back in 2010, obviously, the Labour Party lost, but it probably would have been a majority for the Conservatives had it not been for the North and Scotland. There was still that base that kind of saved Labour, even though it was a loss. It was a hung parliament. But now you're seeing the Conservative base going towards reform. And as you pointed out, you think it's plausible the Conservatives could have double-digit seats, or number of seats. And the Labour Party, they're enjoying a huge polling lead. But where's their base? And I think this actually poses a problem, obviously, for the Conservatives, but for the Labour Party too. They're obviously not reaching to the base and expanding out. They're completely ignoring their base, trashing their base in order to go for the Middle England. And I think that's great in terms of electability in this election. Obviously, mostly that's helped by the Conservative collapse. But that means Keir Starmer could be out just as quickly.
Yes.
And that also, and because of that, Labour are in danger too.
I think that's a really important point. Yeah, but this is entirely a tale of Tory destruction. Their base has been amongst older socially conservative people, and demographic change means with every passing year there are more younger people and there are less of those voters. That's just a fact. So even that is a problem that they face. That's an existential problem for them. They're on for people under 40, under 50, the Green Party is ahead of the Conservative Party. But I think that the point about the Labour Party is, there was actually quite an interesting thread by someone, I forget their name. They're a journalist who's, let's put it this way, just very hostile to the Labour left, certainly. But they make the point that Labour has this surge is very superficial. And Peter Kellner, who co-founded YouGov, who is, I would say, it's not unfair to say he's affiliated with kind of New Labour political wing of politics. He did a really interesting article earlier this year where he pointed out Keir Starmer was by far the most unpopular leader of the opposition to secure a majority. If you compare him to leaders of the opposition, whether that be Margaret Thatcher in the 70s, whether that be Tony Blair, whether that be David Cameron, he is way below them. There's no enthusiasm for Keir Starmer because he doesn't, what would you be enthusiastic about? Even New Labour had cut through ideas at the time. I mean, they had the minimum wage, just as one example, as a totemic policy. That was their anti-poverty measure. It wasn't sufficient by any stretch, but it was something that they could, as a flagship policy. They had the windfall tax and privatised utilities. They abolished the internal market of the NHS, reduced class sizes with the general education frame, devolution. I mean, if you look at New Labour, they were really substantial figures. Obviously, we object to them. I think probably want Tony Blair in The Hague, wouldn't we? But I mean, they were definitely substantial figures. And a lot of the people around that project had a kind of intellectual hinterland. They actually came, a lot of them, from Euro-communism, which was this wing of the communist movement, which it had its wing in the British Communist Party. They had a magazine called Marxism Today. And Marxism Today was very influential on what became New Labour. Tony Blair was an avid reader. I read an interview with Tony Blair in 1990 in Marxism Today, where he described himself as an avid, committed reader of the magazine. And they had this whole analysis of how the British economy had shifted because of what they described as post-Fordism. So you had the kind of old, like Ford the car, you had the kind of manufacturing communities based around industries, and then those industries disappeared and everything became more transient and atomized. So the point is, they had the kind of intellectual rationale for what they were doing. And a lot of, some of the advisors for New Labour were people from Marxism Today. I mean, Peter Mandelson used to be in the Young Communist League, though he actually apparently joined because he had a crush on someone called Steve Howell, who then became an advisor to Jeremy Corbyn. It's a funny old world. But the point I make is, it came from this, you had to kind of, they were bit, Alistair Campbell, Peter Mandelson, Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, just as examples, were substantial figures. And they had people who had a kind of intellectual rationale for what they were trying to do. This sort don't have that. They have kind of middle managers. They're kind of like technocratic middle managers with no real depth to their projects. They're winning by default. And the difference is, and this is a really important point, New Labour came to power in an age of benign conditions. There was growth and there were rising living standards. And because of an unsustainable model, you had it went pop in 2008. But it was a mirage, but it didn't feel like that in 1997. The Tory slogan in 1997 was "Britain is booming, don't let Labour ruin it." And they don't have any of that. They boxed themselves into a corner with their fiscal rule and not increasing taxes on the well-off, so they don't have money for public services, in a far worse situation than they were in 1997. And people's living standards have obviously fallen in a way that they hadn't in 1997. So they come to power with no enthusiasm, in far worse conditions, with far fewer policies, and with nothing meaningful to address the crises, which are far worse than they were in 1997. That's a problem. That's a big problem for them.
I push back on the point when people try and compare Keir Starmer to Tony Blair. And they say, it's Blair Mark too. But and you pointed it out eloquently, they're radically different in a way. I would say that Tony Blair was confident. He didn't need to purge the left. He didn't need to get rid of them. He was confident in his abilities and his vision. Obviously, we very much disagree with it. Whereas Keir Starmer is completely different. I think he's an empty vacuum. He doesn't really have anything. He doesn't really believe anything. I think he's essentially a very weak leader. So when people compare the two, I think it's entirely different. Also, the circumstances are very, very different today, which is astonishing why Labour won't offer even a sprinkle of social democratic policies when things are so bad. Now, if we get back to Keir Starmer, there were people on the left initially who backed him. His pitch was essentially Corbyn in a suit. You even wrote an article in The Guardian saying, we should give him a benefit of doubt. at what point did you realise that Starmer is a liar and he had no intention of supporting transformational policies and that he's just really right wing?
Yeah, I mean, I voted for Rebecca Long Bailey, but you're absolutely right. But when he won, I suppose, the position at the time was everyone kind of left figures said, you can't start from a position of hostility. It will go down like a cup of sick. So at the time, people like Len McCluskey or Jeremy Corbyn or John McDonnell, all did the same. We were, welcome on the, the basis of his policies, rah, rah, rah. So at the time, I wrote a piece which was, I didn't back the guy, but you have to accept, obviously he's the leader now, and we should accept the mandate on which he won, which means those are I wrote in the article about red lines that he cannot cross. And that was on the policies that he stood on, which was nationalisation, taxing the rich, abolishing tuition fees. There's a whole host of them. Yeah, I'm not, and it's quite difficult at the time because obviously, in that position in which you can obviously have doubts based not least about some of the people around him. Because at the time, what he did is he brought on some people from the Corbyn era. So he brought on Simon Fletcher, who ran Jeremy Corbyn's campaign. Then he worked for Keir Starmer. But there were other people there like Annalise Midgley, who's now standing as a Labour MP, I know, who also was one of the people behind the Corbyn campaign back in 2017, not 1917, blimey, not the Bolsheviks. There were a few others. So at the time, these are people I've known for years, and obviously they believed it.
Laura Parker actually from Momentum, she even backed Keir Starmer.
I didn't even say that. Yeah, Laura Parker used to be the national coordinator of Momentum, and then she backed Starmer. Yeah, there were a whole host of people who actually, believed it and voted for it. But the point is he tried to, at the time it just seemed like such an audacious thing that you'd wage war on it. It's very difficult as well at the time because you kind of think, well, you come out swinging, most people just be like, you look like an idiot. I mean, for me, I suppose that was a kind of formative experience because you kind of think, well, just, you should just go on base, even if it looks a bit wacky, and even if, because at the time, especially given if you've got a situation where you've got like the left MPs who at the time included Corbyn and Jeremy and John and Len at the time, head of Unite, going, we've got to accept someone in good faith, and they did it because it would have just looked so mad if they hadn't, basically, and it would have looked like giving ammunition for.
If I'm honest, I never really trusted him from the beginning, but I was also very much like I would absolutely vote Labour and Keir Starmer if he's going to keep these pledges.
Yeah,
I also understand that. We defended Jeremy Corbyn because he was elected by the membership, right? And Keir Starmer was elected in the same model, so it would be hypocritical.
But
so
also, it looks as though then you're playing into the kind of like,
exactly.
Well, they started it. But the point of just in terms of that changing in terms of the position, because my position there, and I just kind of found the article just so I can work out the timings, is it became very clear to me very quickly that he wasn't obviously going to stick to his mandate. Now, what he used to do, and I'll just say this because it's quite funny, is he used to like text me when he became Labour leader, when I criticised him, with these really thin-skinned text messages. I won't divulge what they said, but they were thin-skinned. And one of them, for example, was over Black Lives Matter, when he said it was like, so that was July 2020. So it was only like a couple of months afterwards. I can't remember. Yeah, I mean, there was over that when I was very harsh in criticising what he said about Black Lives Matter. It sent me, extremely annoyed. It was just ridiculous. It was like, why are you texting me? You're not my dad. So I would say basically as soon as he became leader, as soon as he started crossing red lines throughout 2020, and what I will say is, after Jeremy Corbyn lost, after he took the whip away, I challenged him to say that I think the people around you are seeking to purge the left, and this is about purging the left and all the rest of it. And he was like, I am not trying to purge the left. He said, I have no interest. I have no interest in purging the left. This is about taking on anti-Semitism, which I don't see as a left-right issue. That's what he said to me. Now, I haven't had any meaningful contact with him since 2021 of any description. But the point I'd make is, I criticise him after he became leader based on him doing terrible things.
Mm.
I mean, what he said about Black Lives Matter was grossly insensitive at the time. He said that it was a moment rather than, it's just stuff like that.
I mean, I
Yeah.
think but there is a kind of a discussion between whether Keir Starmer was always right wing. You have people like Margaret Hodge saying he did lie to membership to get elected. I think that is an element of
She
truth
said an
there.
ally. An ally
Well,
of his said that.
an ally said that. There's an element of truth to that which I believe, but at the same time, I also think that he is, like I said, a vacuum. That actually he's not that strong-willed, and there may have been times when he was actually happy to work with the left. But you've got people behind him from Labour Together. You've got Morgan McSweeney. They're the ones who's really controlling things, and actually Starmer will just do what he says. So it's not necessarily Starmer's is ideologically against the left, but it's people behind him, and that actually maybe after 5 years of a Starmer government, Morgan McSweeney and others will dispose of him and put in someone who's more ideologically aligned, like Rachel Reeves or Wes Streeting.
West Street. Yeah, I'm torn over this because I just think basically, look, why is he appointed all these right wing ghouls?
Mm.
And one shadow cabinet minister who's not the left told me that there had been basically this right wing project for many years, and they tried to find who would be their best candidate. And obviously that ended up being Keir Starmer. And we know that because Morgan McSweeney, who used to run Liz Kendall's campaign, the Blairite campaign in 2015, and only won 4.5% of the vote, which is for them, a very emotionally scathing moment where they went, we can't go through that again. Because then basically that campaign was like, we're going to cut benefits, we're going to have loads of nuclear weapons. It was just, Labour members were like, why am I going to vote for this? So they were like, we can't do that again. We have to understand where where our selector is. So, why did he appoint people like that? And Matt Pound, Matt Pound is someone who is from the old Labour right, Labour First, so the kind of Luke Akehurst wing. People like that were appointed. And, I wrote about him being an ice pick during the leadership campaign. I wrote that in The Guardian about how Keir Starmer had appointed someone like him who's just, I said he was a walking ice pick. And then Matt Pound asked for me to go to the pub with him. He met me. No, I'm not. I don't ice pick left. Why would you say that? It's so mean. It was like, I think, the Jon Snow and so on. I would never do that. Honestly, Owen, please believe me. Crocodile T smile. So the point I'm making is some people around him think, basically, who've worked around him, think he's not that bright when it comes to politics. But he doesn't seem to understand politics. That's their general gist. That's what they think. And they're a bit like, these people around him have basically used him as a vehicle for their politics. Now, I don't, he appointed these people, so that, do you know what I mean? I don't know how far you go with that. I mean, one of the points I would make is, and obviously I wrote about this the point just before I make this point is, the other thesis that's often put forward is after he lost the Hartlepool by-election, that caused a massive crisis of self-confidence in him. I mean, he said publicly now, we know from his biographer that he nearly resigned. Damn. After he lost the Hartlepool by-election in May 2021, and Angela Rayner, the deputy leader, tried to overthrow him. They've never forgiven her for that. She tried to launch a coup to remove Keir Starmer as leader of the Labour Party, and they were like, no deputy leader in history has ever tried to do that. How dare she? And they tried to anyway. That's what happened at the time. But the argument is he then made a pact with the devil, with the most hard right of the Labour Party, that he would do exactly what they wanted from then on. That's the kind of thesis put forward. The point I would also make is one of my oldest friends, he used to be one of my closest friends, Chris Ward, who I worked with in Parliament when I worked for John McDonnell, and then Alan Simpson, left-wing MP. He ended up working as chief of staff for Keir Starmer before 2021. And he was always someone on the right of the Labour Party. So, and the reason I mention that is he's now been parachuted in to replace Lloyd Russell Moyle. And I wrote a long piece about this, which some people are like, this is a terrible betrayal of your friend. Whatever you think about politics, and you can't do this. Because I just went through, I was disgusted by what happened. And what I would say is, I don't betray my friends, obviously. I have one red line, I think. I've got lots of friends in different friendship groups. Some of them strongly disagree with me from different directions, I would say, is, honesty. And what Chris Ward did is just fed me dishonesty about Keir Starmer and all the rest of it in an effort to destroy everything I believed in. I think he's crossed the red line there. And then Lloyd Russell Moyle suddenly, is taken out with a very nicely timed complaint put against him, so that Chris Ward can be suddenly parachuted into a seat he always wanted, because he spent years telling me he desperately wanted to be an MP in Brighton. The point I'm making is, I just think, look, he's clearly instinctively on the right. However poorly defined his politics might be, he always turned up to his local constituency Labour Party and voted with the right. So I just think, based on what I know, I would say he's clearly just someone who's instinctively on the right. And I don't believe for a second, I remember saying to him as well, I was asked again, might as well tell you all this. But during the leadership contest, he invited his team invited a load of left commentators to go and meet him in a pub in King's Cross, and he kind of held court. And I was actually, do you want some time to speak to him? I was like, so I said to him, well, in terms of the pledges you made, Keir, whatever you are committing to, like the MPs, the Parliamentary Labour Party don't like these policies. They don't like, for example, tuition fees being scrapped. They just don't believe that was a good policy. And they're going to put a huge pressure on you to get rid of that. So what will you say? How will you resist that pressure if that happens? And he went, well, they will just have to accept, Owen. That is the mandate. That's the mandate in which I stood. No, I just think that's bull. I don't believe for a second he believed in those policies. I don't think there's anything in his history suggests.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he believed in left-wing policies, but I think his potential. Really, he's a very weak man. It's other people who are ideologically right-wing. I think that's in my assessment there.
So in terms of the leadership campaign, just to kind of zone in just to how just unbelievably dishonest these people are. And again, normally you're not supposed to say, like, reveal this sort of thing, but I just kind of think, if you have someone you're friends with and they go to such clear, dramatic and extreme lengths to deceive you, and actually therefore try and make you professionally dishonest yourself in your work, then I just think you've sort of abandoned any right to not be discussed in this way. So Chris Ward, who I mentioned, who was a very long-standing friend and is one of Keir Starmer's closest allies, what he told me was, in the pub just over there, actually, where I'm sitting, he said, Owen, we'd love John McDonnell to stay on as Shadow Chancellor. Oh, we'd really love it
about that. Yeah,
he did. He just doesn't want to, He doesn't want to stay on. But we would love him if he was our Shadow Chancellor. Yeah, I mean, it's just that level of dishonesty is. I mean, it's kind of. You kind of either just get, because I don't want to end up in a situation where you're just like devoured by bitterness, because then they win. So now, in a way, I mean, obviously I'm angry about it. I mean, what can you do about it? About being a human being and not a robot. But now I'm like, part of me just let it wash over me. Like, just that is hilarious. It's just funny. It is quite funny in the abstract. Obviously, Tony Blair did not run in 1994 pretending to be Tony Benn. He didn't run basically as like, I'm Tony Benn, but unifying and more competent. Which was what Keir Starmer's pitch. He made it clear where he was coming from in 1994. This is the most dishonest campaign of any description in a major setting, that is, in British democratic history. They are ruthlessly dishonest. And the point I would make about this whole project is they're not very good. They're not talented in the way New Labour were. They're toxic in their behaviour. They're bitter and vindictive. I just don't think it's going to work out for them, if I'm honest. I just think it's too dishonest. They're not good enough. They're not talented enough. They don't have any ideas. They're good at hating the left and being around at the right time when the Conservative Party implodes of its own volition.
Well, I mean, there's an element of nastiness, because in terms of Labour internal politicking, they have won, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not just about winning, though. It seems that they want to humiliate.
Yes.
Whether it's Faiza Shaheen, whether it's Diane Abbott, they want to humiliate these people. And I think it's sick. And it's not just that there is a faction of people in the Labour Party who have some really, I think, heinous political positions. Luke Akehurst, for one. Just look at his Twitter feed. But there's a culture within this group. I don't know where it's come from. I don't know if you have more insight than I do. But this culture of bullying and nastiness, which is almost unprecedented. Do you think that's probably a pinch of truth?
They are, the Labour right remains. I'm 39 years old now. I'm a geriatric millennial approaching. I've been around politics for a very long time, unfortunately, and I've been around the Labour Party for a very long time. So I know these people. I know, I know some of the people now who are going to be running the country when we were all inconsequential bag carriers in Parliament. You know, um, but the Labour right are some of the nastiest people I've met. I'm not just talking about politics. I just mean in life. They are horrible people. Some of them just really horrible, nasty, soulless, dead behind the eyes, horrible people. Weird and horrible, I would say. And I think, they are that the point is that they are vindictive. I remember, I was watching actually, and I've known Pfizer obviously for years. I think Pfizer Shaheen is a brilliant person, brilliant candidate, head and shoulders above any of these weirdos running the Labour Party. Um, which is why they got rid of her, because they thought she'd actually be a convincing leader of the left in Parliament. That's clearly why they got rid of her. Um, uh, Nicholas Watt, the BBC political correspondent, Newsnight political guy, he said a Labour aide had told him a bad moon is rising for these people. I was thinking, fuck off.
I mean, it was quite telling that Laura Kuenssberg, who could have mentioned it for the last
Oh yeah,
9 years, but failed to mention it, that when
we'll take them apart piece by piece.
Yeah, when Jeremy Corbyn
Yeah.
won the leadership, she
Yeah,
was
these
approached by someone saying the visceral hatred or the anger that they felt because he won a democratic election. Which, thanks Laura for not mentioning that. But
Yeah,
you don't see this on the left.
No, absolutely. Like, I mean, the fact is, if someone on the left had said, of any consequence or power, had said, we're going to take up our opponents apart piece by piece, that would be a national scandal. Let's just be absolutely clear about that. Their politics are without soul, they don't have any soul. It's not like, there's no, they don't see injustice and feel emotional about it. They don't think, that doesn't make that heart beat a bit faster. They're student politicians of the worst kind. They're people who, many of them cut their teeth fighting the left, who they call the trots, and by trot they mean people to the left of Gordon Brown. And that's clear, by the way, from the leaked Labour files. They made that clear. You had Labour figures in those leaked reports praising Douglas Murray, who's probably the most right-wing commentator in the British media ecosystem. So what we're talking about are people who are completely and utterly devoid of any political soul of any description, but they are vindictive and vengeful. And they get off on humiliating those who frightened them, because their view was the Labour Party was theirs. They ran the Labour Party, and it was like their friendship group, their whole life. And their view was that, from the age of 8, they were standing in front of their bathroom mirror doing the power thumb thing, doing a speech, pretending they were at a conference as they imagined themselves on the road to becoming the prime minister of the country. And they were like, suddenly that vanished. Suddenly they were nothing. They were inconsequential. It didn't matter how well connected they were within the Labour Party, and that frightened them. They were like, suddenly all their dreams had been snatched away from them. And someone actually did brief, it was briefed by Channel 4 in 2015, where one of them briefed to a journalist, this ends with the left being put in a box for the next 30 years or driven out the party altogether. So they always make clear from the beginning they were going to, this was going to be like, don't just destroy them, but humiliate them in the process. And that is what they will continue to seek to do.
You hear a lot about how the left care more about changing the party than winning. And actually the Labour right are more pragmatic. But every accusation is a confession. I mean, you can see that the main political project, I mean, some even admit that, is to rid the party of the left. And we can see in 2017 with the leaked documents that there was a secret campaign, unbeknown to Jeremy Corbyn. There were secret funds going to safe seats rather than swing seats. And there were people saying we worked against a Jeremy Corbyn victory. So again, these accusations are a confession. Now,
yeah,
you've been in politics for such a long time. You've also met many Tory MPs and Tory activists. And could you comfortably say that actually many figures in the Labour right are a lot worse on a personal level than many Conservatives you've met?
The Conservatives I met were just people who were often so contemptuous towards people who, from backgrounds where people had struggled, and towards minorities. And that's very specific, I think, to a lot of those Conservative activists. But they're still, I mean, I don't know. It's difficult to compare, isn't it? But I mean, they I would say these are just, a lot of them are just soulless, nasty people. And they're, that stands in its own right.
So you were a Labour member since you were 15. Okay, so your entire life, essentially. Can you just briefly go over that journey from where you started until today, where you've now openly quit the party. I'd also like to know from a left-wing person's point of view, being in the party, the difference between Blair as Labour Party and Keir Starmer, and that again, like the people seem to compare the two. But from a left-wing perspective, what's that like?
You didn't have at the time Tony Blair, even though you got, you know, various rebellions and left-wing MPs denouncing New Labour and aggress in a passionate terms, he didn't purge them from the Labour Party. You didn't have any of that at all. I mean, they thought to themselves, they were complacent. They were like, well, they're never going to pose any meaningful threats. We don't really care. That was their view. When John McDonnell stood, though, for leader, and I worked for John when John's tried to stand for leader, and that was like the foreshadow of Jeremy Corbyn's later campaign. I think they toyed with the idea of putting him, would they let him go on the ballot paper? But then he debated Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown agreed to go and debate him publicly, and he did really well. And then they decided, no way are we putting this person on the ballot paper. Because then you had the electoral college, which meant he wouldn't have been able to win, realistically. That he was just, Gordon Brown was really rattled. His team were really rattled by it. And they were like, we just can't let this happen. And they really put pressure on Labour MPs not to nominate John McDonnell. But there was none of that, we're going to crush you and destroy you and all the rest of it. That just wasn't the case. In terms of why I left, though, it was about, I think, pragmatic decision, which is, as things stand, there was absolutely no chance in hell, even if you think Labour can be shifted in another direction, whatever you even think about that, internally, without external pressure, there was no chance of that happening at all. Like, absolutely no way, because their view is they think Tony Blair made a mistake, and Tony Blair thinks he made a mistake, which is they were like, well, the left's destroyed. Why do we care? We don't need to get rid of them. They'll die off. That was their view. And then this lot have gone, don't make that mistake again. Don't make that mistake again. This time we just crushed them, and we make sure they can never, ever come back, ever. So we just need to get rid of them, all of them. So my view is that unless you get, the way that UKIP and the Brexit Party achieved that we need similar external pressure. My view is that will only happen when Labour in government. In the same way, UKIP's rise needed the Conservatives to be in power for that to happen. Because you need a government where people suddenly go, well, we've got a Conservative government, but why aren't they doing this, 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 and this? And in the same way, we'll get a Labour government in a period of crisis. Austerity is going to continue under them. They're not going to change any of the underlying fundamentals. I'm going to say it now. I want Faiza Shaheen. I'll just say it. I'm probably not something I should throw around. I think Faiza Shaheen would be a great figurehead, actually. I think she's someone who is extremely intelligent, got loads of ideas, very humane, very relatable, charismatic, likable. She's got presence. Maybe that could be, picking her out could actually end up being a grave error, because at the moment, the problem is we don't have a kind of real focus. You need leaders at the end of the day. You do need figureheads. And I think she could be someone, in the coming period. But the point I'm making is that's what unless we have external pressure, they're just going to destroy the left piece by piece, just as they promised to do. And that's the end of it. So we have to have external pressure. So that's why I left. Obviously, I know it's obviously looking at Labour supporting war crimes and legitimising a genocide. We all have our red lines in politics. I couldn't just morally cope with that, if I'm honest. Just couldn't cope with that.
You made an interesting point there about how it's better for Labour to be in government to push them externally, just how the Reform or UKIP did with the Conservatives. Because I suppose Labour right now have the slight benefit of doubt with the electorate that, well, we just need to get in government. And they're signalling to the media and voters that, the more the left kicks up a fuss, the more they're stopping the chances of Labour government. But when they're in government and when they ultimately, yes, continue austerity and continue bad economic policies, the fiscal rules, for example, I guess you are right. That's probably the opportunity to strike. Now, I want to bring the attention to the campaign you started, which is We Deserve Better. When did this campaign to support independents, the Greens, and some socialist Labour MPs come to you? What was the process behind that?
Well, I think I decided last October, after Emily Thornby, my local MP, went on television and refused to condemn Israel cutting off water, energy, food, and the essentials of life to innocent people in Gaza as a war crime. She refused to condemn it full stop and folded it in Israel's absolute right to defend itself. So I texted at the time and went, I'm never, ever going to vote for you ever again. I voted for 3 times as an MP. I've always got on really well with Emily on a personal level. I was stuck then. I was in this sky. Do I just leave quietly, or do I just try and do something with it? So then I spoke to, I guess, various people who'd been around like the Corbyn projects and stuff, and went, because I didn't want to lead anything. I don't want to run anything. So I didn't. I wanted to do something where I wasn't in charge or a leader. I can barely tie my shoelaces. So I think I worry too much, things like that, just things which are not compatible with that. So I thought to myself, I thought to myself, well, I could do something where like I leave and just raise money for other candidates. But then I thought, well, we just turn it into something where I don't run it as arm's length, because I don't run We Deserve Better. It's really important to make that clear. Other people do.
I'm very glad that you didn't leave the Labour Party quietly.
No, I know, because I'm still, I didn't know what to do about it, So,
well, I'm glad you announced it, and I'm glad how much you're involved in We Deserve Better. I'm a big supporter of it. So I want to make.
But it's laying the foundations. It's laying the foundations of something else, and that's not something I'm going to lead. Sure. Just to be clear, and it's just it needs people like Faisal Shaheen, I think, because we do need leaders. I know we're a bit like, oh, it's collective power. It is, but you do need leaders.
Now, I think it's fair to say that the growth in independent candidates, the rise of the Green Party, is partly being down to the appalling response from both our political parties in Gaza. I want to ask you, what's it been like, someone like yourself who works in the mainstream media, to see our media landscape pretty much back Israel in the genocide of the Palestinians, and also that includes our politicians too?
I'm not surprised by it, but I still find it shocking, because obviously I know how the media works. I've worked there for a very long time, and I think it's just the lack of like subtlety about Palestinian life meaning nothing. I think that's what I just find so shocking. There's not a pretense. There's no way the people who have just legitimized and sat back whilst the genocide is taking place can possibly say, hand on heart, that they think Palestinian life is equal to that of an Israeli or any other country for that matter. They just don't think that, and they wouldn't be able to. They would have. How would they defend that position? I think just why the facts. What they did, the Western media is complicit with every single death, every single killing, every single murder. Because what if we had a functioning media, they would have framed the coverage for start around what Israelis said they were going to do from the start, because they didn't hide it. But a lot of those statements weren't even reported at the time. So they are accomplices in genocide. That's my view. And they should never, ever be allowed to get away with it. I think, I look at these people with disgust. They disgust me. Nothing I can do about that. I just think if you have, it's not just the people who legitimized it at this point. I just think they're morally depraved freaks. It's not just them. It's the people who stayed silent or just occasionally done a bit of hand wringing. Oh, it's sad, isn't it? I think they're bastards. I think they are monsters. And I think if you are someone with a public platform who's failed to put pressure on your government, as it has facilitated a genocide, you're a moral disgrace, and you have no right to comment on any moral issue ever again. Not this, not that, not anything else. But they have legitimized it, and that just shows it's a racist media. And there are courageous people who've spoken out, and but the people. But I look at this as just an abomination, and the fact that the Western media has, basically portrayed it as Israel's right to self-defense with a side debate about have they gone too far or not? Is this proportionate or not? I mean, it's just obscene. I mean, you just watched an area the size of East London be wiped from the face of the earth with explosive powers several times that of Hiroshima bombs. So it's a different color and texture when looked at from space, where tens of thousands of people have been burned to death or buried to death, including 15,000 children. The mass maiming and the mass violent displacement and the famine, which has been intentionally caused by Israel. And you can't say anything meaningful about it. Like, you're a moral disgrace. You should, and these people, can never ever be allowed to get away with it. But yeah, the Western, I just find it shows what the Western media is like. It's a racist industry which legitimizes heinous crimes.
Given that the Green Party has been doing phenomenally well, I mean, they picked up 800 councillors at the local election. It's no surprise they're now facing attacks, but specifically on anti-Semitism. Now, to do a bit of a retrospective here, I and yourself have never claimed that anti-Semitism never existed in Labour under Jeremy Corbyn. I've never had truck with it's all a scam. There's all forms of racism in every party because it exists in society. But given how we've got people claiming the UN is anti-Semitic, the Green Party is harboring anti-Semites, that isn't those of us who said that anti-Semitism was weaponized and exaggerated under Corbyn's Labour, have we been somewhat vindicated?
The Labour leadership, it's a smear to say the Labour leadership is anti-Semitic or Jamie Corbyn is anti-Semitic or the vast majority of Labour members are anti-Semitic. That's just false. And there was a small number of people who engage in either anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic tropes who are not representative, but who cause hurt to Jewish people. And that's true. The claims about Jamie Corbyn being anti-Semitic are false. They're entirely false. And the claims that there was rampant anti-Semitism in the Labour leaders in membership was entirely false. And it is true that anti-Semitism is a great evil and that it exists and it's rising, I would say, globally. Like, no question at all about that. And there are those who use false claims about anti-Semitism in order to destroy people who stand up to crimes by the Israeli state, which is just a fact. And no one can deny that fact. And they're dangerous because they actually stop people believing in anti-Semitism. So I would say that's absolutely true. I think there were people who just, I just think sometimes in that whole period, because I think there is the demarcation I talk about is like, you had people who, for example, would spread the idea that there was a role of Jewish people in the slave trade historically. And then they would claim, well, I'm being witch hunted over Palestine. It's like, you're not talking about Palestine there. You're talking about just a false narrative. There was no meaningful involvement by Jewish people in the slave trade historically. So I suppose the only thing I would say is you did get that at the time. I'm not naming the person, but they did. That's the point they made. They alluded to the involvement. And that is a false history, which was actually promoted by Louis Farrakhan from the Nation of Islam. Any genuine historical. The point I'm making is there were people who said things which were just completely false and caused hurt. And then there were other people who were clearly just being demonized because of their position on Gaza. And there had to be a bit of a demarcation. But generally speaking, there's no question that anti-Semitism is very real and it needs to be taken on. And there are bad faith merchants who defend the state of Israel and its crimes, who use false claims of anti-Semitism to demonize their opponents. And that's what they've now done on a mass scale. And yet you mentioned Luke Akehurst there, or alluded to him, who is now standing as a candidate, who tweeted saying the United Nations is anti-Semitic. I mean, what are you supposed to do with this information? I mean, it's ludicrous. And I think that is unbelievably dangerous and irresponsible. And we've seen a war on people who are Jewish. I remember defending Jo Bird at the time. Jo Bird, who was hounded out of the Labour Party, and I defended her at the time when she was attacked. She's now standing for the Green Party. She was, when you got so many people who are Jewish being accused of anti-Semitism, I mean, it's just so ludicrous, and dangerous and irresponsible.
Owen, really insightful conversation. Also, congratulations on the recent milestone of hitting 565,000 subscribers on your YouTube channel. Well done.
Bless you.
I'm also completely supportive of the We Deserve Better campaign. But again, I really appreciate your time. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your brilliant work. You're always insightful, amazing, great stuff. Well done on your YouTube channel, which is exploding and will take over the YouTube ecosystem anytime. No, seriously, it's great. The great stuff. I've seen your content, your videos. They're brilliant. And thank you for everything you do.